Imagine walking into an interview, ready to prove yourself, only to be humiliated by a racist employer who dismisses you with a mocking smile. But what if that employer had no idea that you were about to expose a secret that would turn everything upside down? In this shocking twist, one man reveals the truth that leaves his would-be boss speechless, and it's not what anyone expected. Stay tuned to see how power, prejudice, and pride collide in a way no one saw coming. Ethan walked into the sleek office building, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the smooth white floor. Everything around him looked immaculate. Clean lines, shiny surfaces, the kind of place where everything seemed perfect, almost cold. He'd been to countless interviews like this before, but today felt different. Today he wasn't just trying to land a job. He had something else in mind. His hands gripped his resume tightly as he approached the front desk. The receptionist, busy typing away, barely looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely glancing at him. "I'm here for an interview. Ethan Wright," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nerves. She finally looked at him, her eyes taking in his suit, his confident posture. Without a smile, she gestured toward a row of empty chairs. "Please take a seat. Mr. Pierce will be with you shortly." Ethan sat down, trying to steady himself. He'd done this 100 times, but today was different. He thought back to his childhood, growing up in a small apartment with his mom, working hard just to survive. He remembered the teachers at school, always surprised by how articulate he was for someone from his background. It stung, but he'd learned to push it down, smile, and move on. But today, that same feeling crept back. The door to the office opened. A man stepped out, tall, sharply dressed, his face a little too smooth. He extended a hand, his grip strong, almost deliberately firm. "Mr. Pierce, I assume," Ethan said. "Ethan Wright, yes, come on in," Pierce said with a tight smile. He led Ethan into his office, a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows showing off the city skyline. Everything about the room screamed power. Expensive furniture, shiny surfaces, pristine. Pierce, standing by his desk, had an air of someone who was used to being in control. Ethan took a seat across from him, trying to maintain his calm. He wasn't here to beg for a job, but Pierce wasted no time, flipping through Ethan's resume with a mix of interest and subtle judgment. "So, Mr. Wright, you've had some impressive roles, but I have to ask," Pierce said, raising an eyebrow. "What brings you to us? Why our company?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "I've been following your company for years. I think I could help take it to the next level. Your work here is exciting, and I'd love to be a part of that." Pierce nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Ethan. He glanced back at the resume again, then at Ethan's face, sizing him up. "I see. And where did you say you went to school? Not exactly one of the Ivy League schools, huh?" Ethan didn't flinch. "State University. It's a solid school, and I've had the chance to work with some of the best in the industry." Pierce's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, it's not always about the school, is it? But more about fitting into the culture. We've got a very specific environment here." Ethan kept his expression neutral. He knew exactly what Pierce meant. It wasn't about his skills or experience. It was about whether he looked the part, whether he fit into Pierce's idea of what the company should be. And Ethan had seen this before, the hidden prejudice, the assumption that someone like him might not belong. "I think I'd fit in just fine," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I've worked with all kinds of people in all kinds of environments. I know how to contribute." Pierce's smile tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "It's just, with your background, Mr. Wright, you might find it hard to adjust to the kind of people we have here. Our team, they're used to a certain standard." Ethan's heart beat a little faster, but he didn't show it. He had heard this before, the coded language, the assumption that because he didn't come from the right place with the right background, he might not be good enough. "I handle pressure well," Ethan said. I've been doing it my whole life." Pierce gave a short laugh, almost dismissive, then quickly smoothed his expression. "Well, of course, but, our company is all about a certain type of person. Someone who really embodies our values." Ethan didn't react. He had heard enough. It was clear Pierce was trying to let him down gently, maybe in a way that was designed to make him feel inferior. But Ethan wasn't having it. He'd played this game before, and he wasn't going to let it slide this time. "I'm actually not here for an interview," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to tell you that I'm the owner of this company." Pierce froze. For a moment, his face was a mask of confusion. He blinked, trying to process what Ethan had just said. The silence stretched between them, heavy with disbelief. Ethan didn't break eye contact. Pierce's mouth opened, but no words came out. It was clear he hadn't expected this. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Pierce blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His eyes darted to Ethan's calm face, searching for any hint of a joke, some sign that this was just a strange misunderstanding. But there was nothing. Ethan's expression was unwavering, his hands still resting on his lap, his posture as composed as ever. "You... what?" Pierce stammered, his voice rising in disbelief. "You're the owner?" Ethan's lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. There was no anger in his tone, no triumph, just the quiet finality of someone who had seen this all before. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm the owner of this company. I've been the owner for years." Pierce blinked again, this time more slowly, as if trying to make sense of the words that had just been spoken. He opened his mouth, clearly about to say something, but no words came out. His face flushed a deep shade of red, the color creeping up his neck, turning his jawline tight with frustration. It was a look of someone who had just been caught in a lie, but worse. It was the look of someone who had just realized the very thing they thought was under their control was slipping away. "You've been running this company?" Pierce's voice was almost a whisper now, as if the concept was too absurd to grasp. He took a step back, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk as though steadying himself. Ethan's gaze never left him. "I've been running it, managing it, growing it. The whole time," he said, his voice quiet, steady. "And you, Mr. Pierce, have been working for me for a long time." Pierce looked at him, disoriented. He opened his mouth again, but nothing coherent came out. His fingers twitched, searching for something, anything to say that could regain control of the situation. But control was no longer his. Ethan sat there, watching as Pierce's mind worked overtime, trying to adjust to a reality that had just shattered his perception. The man was a creature of habit, someone who had likely built his career on the comfort of knowing where he stood. And in that moment, everything had been turned upside down. Pierce had no idea how to respond, how to recover from this. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and he was left scrambling for answers he didn't have. Ethan leaned forward, just enough for the shift in his posture to emphasize the authority he now had in the room. "I don't blame you for your assumptions, Mr. Pierce. This is a world you're used to. But I don't tolerate prejudice, even if it's subtle, and I can't afford to have anyone running my company who thinks like you." Pierce's eyes widened, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. The anger that had been building in Ethan, the quiet rage of years spent navigating spaces like this, began to show. He wasn't just taking back control of a situation, he was making a statement. The moment stretched on, each second thick with the tension of a conversation that had just gone off the rails. Finally, Pierce managed to clear his throat, the sound raspy, his pride clearly wounded. You're just going to throw everything away over a small misunderstanding?" His voice was shaky, desperate, as if pleading for Ethan to somehow back down, to let him find some way out of this. But Ethan wasn't having it. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Pierce," he said, his tone flat. "This is who I am, and this is how I run my company, with respect for everyone, regardless of where they come from, how they look, or what school they went to. It's not just a job, it's about values." Pierce's face twisted into a mix of disbelief and frustration. his eyes darting around the office, as though the walls were closing in on him. He took a step back, shaking his head slowly, trying to grasp the gravity of what had just been said. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "You can't be serious." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Pierce studying him, watching the man wrestle with his own discomfort, his own prejudice. It was clear that this was a new experience for Pierce, one that he wasn't prepared for. He had likely spent his entire career using his privilege to keep people like Ethan at arm's length, to push them aside when they didn't fit. And now, that very privilege had failed him. Ethan was no longer the applicant in the room, the one who had to prove his worth. Ethan was the one in control. "I'm very serious," Ethan said after a beat, his voice low and calm. "I'm also very disappointed. You were given a chance to show that you could handle this position, but you've shown me exactly who you are." Pierce took another step back, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't just his job on the line. It was his entire worldview, his sense of self. Everything he'd known about his place in the corporate ladder was suddenly in question, upended by a man he had assumed was beneath him. His pride, his identity, everything was crumbling in front of him. Ethan stood up slowly, deliberately, as if the moment required more than a hasty retreat. "I'll have HR contact you about your termination," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "I'm sure you'll find another company that's more in line with your values." Pierce didn't respond. He simply stood there, his face pale, his body rigid with humiliation. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls growing tighter, the reality of what was happening sinking deeper into his bones. Ethan gave him one last look, then turned and walked out of the office, leaving the stunned silence in his wake. As he walked down the hallway, his steps were measured, purposeful. He wasn't just leaving a meeting. He was leaving behind a system that had for too long ignored the worth of people like him, a system that had underestimated him at every turn. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the weight of his own power. It wasn't about the money, the position, or the title. It was about dignity, about standing up to those who tried to diminish him. He'd made his mark today, not just on Pierce, but on the whole system that had kept him on the outside. And as the elevator doors closed behind him, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. Ethan stepped into the elevator, his reflection briefly catching in the mirrored doors as they closed behind him. The quiet hum of the machinery was the only sound, but his mind buzzed with a whirlwind of emotions. There was no feeling of triumph, no rush of satisfaction. The weight of the moment hung around him like a dense fog. He had done what he came here to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like something much bigger, something that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. As the elevator descended, Ethan allowed himself a few breaths, steadying his thoughts. He had always known the system was stacked against him. In so many ways, it had been a fight from the beginning. Growing up in a neighborhood where success felt like a distant dream, attending a university that was good, but not prestigious, working his way up from internships to corporate roles, never quite fitting the mold, always having to prove himself more than others. But this was different. This wasn't just about fighting for a job. This was about taking back control, about confronting the subtle prejudices that had followed him throughout his life, and demanding respect. The elevator chimed as it reached the ground floor, and Ethan stepped out into the lobby. The front desk receptionist gave him a brief nod, her eyes scanning him quickly. She had no idea what had just transpired. No idea that the man who had walked into this building, who had been just another face, just another candidate, is now the owner of the company she worked for. Ethan didn't look back. He walked out of the building with purpose, his eyes fixed on the busy street ahead. As he stepped outside into the cool air, he felt a strange mixture of relief and weight settling on his shoulders. He had never imagined that taking control of the company would feel like this, like the beginning of something larger than himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Without hesitation, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant, Carla. The board meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow at 10 o'clock. They're expecting an update from you. Call me when you're free." Ethan tucked the phone back into his pocket, his thoughts already racing. He had known the board would be an issue. They were a conservative group, mostly white, mostly male, and used to the status quo. They had been comfortable with the idea of him running the company quietly behind the scenes, but not so comfortable with the idea of a black man in the CEO position. He had been building up to this moment for years, quietly gathering the kind of power that couldn't be ignored. But now, as the reality set in, Ethan felt a sharp tug of doubt. How would they react to this? Would they challenge him? Would they even accept him? His mind wandered back to his encounter with Pierce. The look on his face, the stunned silence when Ethan had revealed himself as the owner, had been exactly what he'd expected. Pierce was so used to having the upper hand, so used to being in control, that the mere suggestion that someone like Ethan could be his boss seemed incomprehensible. But Pierce wasn't the real threat. The real challenge lay with the board, with the people who controlled the company's direction. If they didn't accept him, his position could be in jeopardy before he even had a chance to prove himself. He needed to be prepared. Ethan made his way to his car, pushing the thoughts of the board aside for a moment, focusing on the present. The crisp air felt good against his skin, the weight of the moment beginning to shift, his mind settling into focus. Carla had been with him for years. She knew how to navigate the politics of the company better than anyone. Ethan trusted her judgment, and he needed her to help him prepare for the board meeting tomorrow. It wasn't just about them accepting him. It was about making them understand that they had no choice but to work with him, to see him for what he was, the owner, the leader, the one in charge. When he reached his car, he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot and into traffic, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from his older brother, Malik. Ethan smiled despite himself. Malik was always there, always checking in, always offering support. He could always count on Malik to provide a dose of real talk when things got complicated. "Yo, Ethan, you good?" Malik's voice came through the speaker, low and steady. Ethan glanced at the road before responding. "Yeah, I'm good. Just left Pierce's office." Malik laughed softly. "And what happened?" "I told him I'm the owner of the company." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Malik spoke, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and pride. "No way. You actually did it?" Ethan chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yeah, I did." He didn't know what hit him. It felt good, but it's just the beginning. The board's next. They're not going to be happy about this. Malik was quiet for a beat, clearly processing. "Man, I knew you were gonna get there, but you're right. It's not just about getting the position. It's about staying there. You ready for this? You know they're gonna test you." "I know," Ethan replied, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "But I've been preparing for this. I'm ready." Malik let out a long breath. "Good. You know I'm always here for you, right? Don't let them get in your head. They'll try, but you're the one in charge now." "I appreciate that, Malik," Ethan said, his voice softening. "I really do." There was a brief pause before Malik added, "And, hey, you've got a lot of people behind you, man. You're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who's ever had to fight to be seen, for everyone who's been told they don't belong. You've got this." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had always carried that weight. The knowledge that his success wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. For his mother, who had worked herself to the bone to give him a better life. For every person of color who had faced barriers they shouldn't have had to. "I'll keep that in mind," Ethan said quietly. "I'll call you later. I've got to get ready for tomorrow." "Yeah, man. Go make 'em sweat," Malik said, his voice full of encouragement. As Ethan hung up and focused back on the road, a sense of clarity began to settle over him. Tomorrow would be the real test. But he had come this far. and he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. The board would either accept him or they would regret trying to push him out. Either way, Ethan Wright was no longer just a man with a dream. He was the man in charge. The next morning arrived far too quickly. Ethan stood before the large mirror in his apartment, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. The reflection staring back at him looked composed, confident, but the weight of what was about to happen was heavy. He had faced many challenges in his life, struggles in school, fights to be heard in boardrooms, but this was different. Today wasn't just another step in his journey. It was the moment that would determine if everything he'd worked for would be respected or dismissed. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the silence. Carla. "Hey, Ethan. The board's already gathered in the conference room. They're waiting for you," she said, her voice steady and calm. "You good?" Ethan took a deep breath before responding. "Yeah, I'm ready." "Remember, you've got this," she added, a hint of reassurance in her tone. "Just walk in there like you belong, because you do." Ethan smiled to himself. He had been hearing this kind of encouragement for years, but somehow today it felt more real, more necessary. He wasn't just walking into a boardroom to give a presentation. He was walking into a room where his very presence would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, leadership, and the rules they played by. He grabbed his coat, slipped it on, and took one last look at himself in the mirror. "Let's do this," he muttered, stepping out the door. The drive to the office was a blur, the usual hum of city traffic fading into the background as his thoughts took over. He couldn't help but replay everything that had led him here. The late nights, the sacrifice, the constant need to prove himself, not just to others but to himself. All of it had been a battle, but one that had shaped him, one that had prepared him for moments like this. As he pulled into the company's parking lot, Ethan felt a mix of nerves and determination rise within him. He knew what he was walking into. The board wasn't going to make this easy. They never did. They would question him, challenge his authority, and push back against his leadership. But Ethan wasn't the same man who had first walked into that small office years ago, desperate for a break. He was the owner now, and it was time they understood that. Carla met him in the lobby, her quick, efficient smile offering a small but welcomed reassurance. She was always calm under pressure, a perfect counterbalance to his own occasional impulsiveness. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face for any signs of doubt. Ethan nodded. "Ready." They walked down the long hallway to the boardroom, each step deliberate, each breath a reminder that today was the culmination of everything he'd worked for. As they approached the door, Carla stopped briefly. "Just take it slow. They're not used to you being this forward. But that's your strength. Own it." Ethan gave a brief nod, taking in the deep breath he needed. When he pushed open the doors, the boardroom fell silent. The group of men and women, older, more seasoned, mostly white, sat around the polished conference table, their eyes immediately turning to him. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of their gazes pressing on him, but Ethan stood tall, his posture unwavering. "Good morning," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I trust you all have your agendas ready." The chair at the head of the table was, as expected, vacant. Ethan walked to the seat without hesitation, sitting down slowly and deliberately. The action was symbolic. He wasn't here to simply participate in their meeting. He was here to lead it. One of the board members, Richard Carlton, a portly man in his 60s with an expensive suit that looked too tight around his shoulders, cleared his throat. His face was a mask of polite curiosity, but Ethan knew that behind it was a simmering frustration. Richard had been with the company for decades and had always assumed that his position gave him control. "Mr. Wright," Richard began, his voice carefully controlled. "I believe we were all under the impression that this meeting would be a simple update on the company's financial outlook. Instead, it seems we've been blindsided by some unexpected news." His eyes narrowed slightly as he spoke. "What exactly do you mean when you say you're the owner of this company?" Ethan held Richard's gaze, refusing to flinch. "I'm the owner," he repeated calmly. "You've all been working for me for years. You may not have known that, but that's the reality." The room seemed to tense, as if the air had suddenly thickened. Eyes darted around the table, looking for some kind of confirmation, some explanation that made sense of this statement. "Are you saying this was some kind of joke?" Another board member, Evelyn Markham, asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Evelyn was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, but her outward confidence now seemed shaky. "You don't look like the type of person who runs a company like ours, Mr. Wright. Forgive me, but your background—" "My background is irrelevant," Ethan interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "What matters is what I bring to this company and what I've already built. You don't get to decide my worth based on your assumptions or expectations. I've been working behind the scenes to make this company successful, and now I'm here to lead it." A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Evelyn's eyebrows raised, but she didn't speak immediately. Richard, on the other hand, looked openly insulted. "And just how do you expect us to accept this? You don't have the credentials we're used to, Mr. Wright. You've had no formal training in running this kind of operation." Ethan didn't flinch. He had been expecting this, had anticipated every objection they could throw his way. The underlying message was always the same. You don't belong here. But that was exactly why he was here. "You don't need a pedigree to run a company," he said, his tone even. "You need vision, leadership, and the ability to make tough decisions. I've got all of that." Richard's face twisted into a frown, clearly trying to process the situation. "And what about our direction? What about the future of this company?" "I'm not here to change everything overnight," Ethan replied, "but I will be making changes. This company is going to grow, and it's going to grow on my terms. If you're on board with that, great. If not, well, there's the door." The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. Each member of the board sat stiffly, eyes flicking from Ethan to one another, as if searching for the right response. But no one spoke. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Richard cleared his throat and gave a sharp nod. "We'll need time to consider your proposal," he said, his voice tight, clearly caught off guard. "This is a lot to digest." Ethan stood, his posture tall and commanding. "Take all the time you need. But just remember, I'm not asking for your approval, I'm telling you how it's going to be." With that, Ethan turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing behind him as the board was left to process the reality of what had just unfolded. Ethan walked out of the boardroom with a quiet confidence that surprised even him. He could hear the murmurs behind him, the questions, the incredulity. He had expected resistance. He had expected this to be hard. But even the weight of the moment didn't feel as heavy as it had a few hours ago. He had taken control, made his move, and now it was up to them to decide how they would react. Carla was waiting for him in the hallway, her posture relaxed but her eyes scanning him for any sign of uncertainty. She had been with him long enough to know that this moment, this confrontation with the board, was the real test. They had been watching him from the shadows for years, evaluating his every move, his every decision, waiting for him to slip. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Ethan didn't immediately answer. He took a deep breath, his eyes moving toward the glass walls of the conference room. The board members were still inside, no doubt discussing what had just transpired. But he wasn't thinking about them right now. He was thinking about the decision he had just made, the one that would change everything. "It went how I expected," he finally said, turning to face her. They were shocked, confused, angry even. But I didn't flinch. I made it clear. This is my company now. Carla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And what's their move? You think they'll accept it?" "They'll have to," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "They can't afford not to." But even as he said it, there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. A whisper that this wasn't going to be as simple as he hoped. The board had the power to make or break him, and if they chose to fight him, It would be a battle he couldn't win by sheer force of will alone. Carla's brow furrowed. "You're sure about that?" "I've been around these people long enough to know that they don't like being told what to do, especially by someone they think they can't control." Ethan met her gaze, his eyes sharp. "I know. But that's the point. They're not in control anymore. I am." Carla didn't say anything for a moment, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew better than anyone that Ethan had earned his position, but she also knew the kind of battles they were about to face. The board would play dirty, they always did, and they would make sure that Ethan knew it. "So what's next?" she asked, breaking the tension in the air. Ethan paused for a moment, considering the question. "We wait. Let them come to us, let them think they have time to figure out what they're going to do. But when they're ready, we're going to hit them hard." Carla raised an eyebrow. "Hit them hard? I'm not going to play their game. If they want a fight, they'll get one, but it's not going to be on their terms. We're going to take the initiative." Carla looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll get things ready on my end. But just so we're clear, when you say hit them hard, you're talking about moving quickly, getting the ball rolling with the changes you've been planning?" "Exactly," Ethan said, his voice steady. "It's time to turn this company into what it should have been from the start. No more slow playing, no more appeasing. The culture of this place has been toxic for too long, and I'm done with it. They either get on board or they don't, but I'm not waiting around for their approval anymore." Carla gave a sharp nod, clearly in agreement. "I'll make sure the communications are lined up. We need to be strategic about this. You can't just fire everyone who disagrees with you." Ethan smiled, a flicker of humor breaking through the tension. "No, not everyone. But we'll be making some key moves. We need people who understand what this company is going to be. I've already got some people in mind." "Good," Carla said. "Let's get ahead of this. I'll start drafting the changes you want to make, and we'll be ready when they come knocking." With that, Ethan turned and began walking toward the elevator. As he pressed the button to call it down, he couldn't help but feel a slight surge of excitement. This was it. The first real test of his leadership. He had done the hard part. He had claimed ownership. He had staked his ground. Now it was time to see if he could truly transform this company. This place that had always been more about tradition than innovation, more about maintaining the status quo than embracing change. The doors to the elevator slid open, and Ethan stepped inside. He glanced at his phone again, checking the time. It was still early in the day, but things were already moving faster than he'd anticipated. He would need to stay ahead of the curve if he wanted to keep his position. The board might have been stunned for now, but they wouldn't stay passive forever. They would fight back, and when they did, he would be ready. As the elevator descended, Ethan's thoughts shifted to the next step. He had been thinking for months about what this company could become, the potential that had been stifled by the old guard, the outdated practices, the bias that permeated every layer. He didn't want to just make money. He wanted to make a difference, a real difference. Ethan was tired of seeing people like him pushed aside, overlooked because of their race, their background, or the color of their skin. This company had the resources to change that, to create a culture that valued diversity, not as a buzzword, but as a cornerstone, to lead by example. He wasn't interested in incremental change. He wanted a revolution, quiet and deliberate, but a revolution nonetheless. The elevator doors opened, and as he stepped out into the lobby, he saw Carla waiting for him. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her face tense as she spoke with someone. When she saw him, she gave a quick nod and ended the call. "They're already starting to make moves," she said, her voice low. "Richard Carlton is meeting with legal about your position. They're not happy, Ethan. They're already trying to figure out how to challenge you." Ethan smiled, the weight of the situation starting to feel lighter. Let them try. This was just the beginning. They might not know it yet, but the real fight was just getting started. The next few days blurred together in a whirlwind of meetings, strategy sessions, and late-night calls with Carla. The board's resistance wasn't just passive. It was actively growing more aggressive. Richard Carlton and his allies were quietly gathering their forces, aligning with some of the company's senior executives who were either blindsided by Ethan's move or outright resentful of his sudden rise to power. The air at the office had shifted. There was a palpable tension, a sense that everything was about to change, but no one knew how or when. Ethan was unfazed. He expected this. The more they pushed against him, the more it solidified his resolve. He had already anticipated the board's resistance and had prepared for the inevitable battle. He had been building alliances, working behind the scenes, long before the reveal in the boardroom. The people he'd quietly placed in key positions, his trusted allies, were now ready to stand by him when the pushback came. But there was one person in particular who still lingered in his mind: Pierce. Pierce had been a thorn in his side from the very start, the one who mocked his ambition, belittled his achievements, and treated him like a nuisance. He was the embodiment of everything Ethan had fought against, a man who thought his wealth, his old-school ways, and his pedigree gave him the right to dismiss anyone he deemed beneath him. The encounter in the office had been a small victory, but Ethan knew that Pierce would never accept him as an equal. If anything, Pierce would be the one to escalate the conflict. He would dig in his heels, throwing his weight around until Ethan was either forced out or forced to play by his rules. Ethan had been expecting a call from Pierce, and sure enough, it came on the 4th day after the board meeting. The phone buzzed in his hand, and he saw the name on the screen: Pierce Matthews. Ethan didn't hesitate. He answered it immediately. "Ethan," Pierce's voice came through, smooth and dripping with feigned politeness. "I trust you're settling into your new role nicely." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm getting there. What do you want, Pierce?" Pierce chuckled softly on the other end. "Straight to the point, I see. Well, let's get down to it then. We both know this whole ownership thing is a little, well, unorthodox. You and I both know that you're not exactly qualified to lead a company like this." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he didn't let his frustration show. "I didn't need your approval before, and I don't need it now." "You're not listening, Ethan," Pierce continued, his tone now dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm trying to offer you a way out here. I'm sure you're aware of the legal avenues we could pursue. This whole arrangement could get very messy, very public. Are you really willing to throw everything away over a position that, quite frankly, you have no business holding?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out of his office window at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the glass buildings. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead of him, but his voice remained calm. "You're wasting your time. I'm not going anywhere." Pierce was silent for a moment. Ethan could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, the irritation growing in his voice. "I thought you'd say that. Just know, I'm not going to let you bulldoze your way through this company. You don't know what you're up against. The board will never accept you. They'll vote you out." "Then they'll have to try," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And when they do, they'll see how hard I'm willing to fight for this, for my company." Pierce's laugh was cold, lacking any real humor. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Ethan. Don't say I didn't warn you." The line went dead, leaving a silence in its wake. Ethan sat there for a long moment, the weight of Pierce's words lingering in the air like smoke. The legal threats, the whispers of the board's dissatisfaction, it all pointed toward one thing. They weren't going to give up without a fight. Pierce's words may have been meant to rattle him, but they only strengthened Ethan's resolve. If Pierce thought he was the only one capable of playing the game, then Pierce had severely underestimated him. As Ethan sat back, his thoughts shifted. He needed a counterattack, a move that would not only solidify his position, but also show the board and Pierce that he wasn't some token figurehead. He was here to stay, and anyone who thought otherwise would have to face the consequences. That night, after the office had emptied out and the halls were quiet, Ethan sat at his desk, a strategy unfolding in his mind. He needed to hit them where it hurt, not just with power, but with something deeper. He needed to show the board that he wasn't just another businessman. He was a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just about boardroom politics anymore. Ethan was ready to make a public statement, a move that would shake things up, that would force their hand. If they wanted to challenge him legally, then let them. Let them expose their true colors. He'd play the game, but he would play it by his own rules. The next day, Ethan called Carla into his office. She entered quietly, already familiar with his focus. "What's the plan?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "We're going public," Ethan said, his voice low but purposeful. "I'm going to make sure the world knows who's in charge. No more behind-the-scenes maneuvering. We're going to force their hand, make it impossible for them to back out." Carla raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Public how?" "Social media. Press an open letter to the shareholders. I'm going to show them that I'm the future of this company. I want to set the tone. Pierce and the board think they can intimidate me, but they're wrong. It's time they realize that I'm not here just for a paycheck. I'm here to lead." Carla nodded, her eyes gleaming with approval. "I like it. Bold move. You think it'll work?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "It has to." As Carla left the room to start drafting the materials, Ethan sat back in his chair, a slow smile creeping across his face. He was about to set a fire, one that would burn through everything in its path. If the board and Pierce wanted to make it personal, he was more than ready to turn the tables. He had spent years proving himself in a system that had never given him a fair shot. Now it was his turn to prove that he was more than just a figurehead. He was the future of this company, and no one was going to take that from him. The following morning, Ethan walked into the office with a sense of calm determination. Today was a pivotal moment, one that would either solidify his position or ignite a full-scale confrontation. He had no intention of backing down, and now it was time to show the world exactly who he was. Carla was already at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she prepared the social media posts, press releases, and the carefully worded letter to the shareholders. Her professionalism was the anchor Ethan needed in this storm, and he appreciated how quickly she had shifted gears to support his plan. This wasn't just about corporate maneuvering anymore. This was about asserting his place, not just in the company but in a world that had always treated him as an outsider. As Ethan passed by her desk, he gave her a nod of approval. "Is everything ready?" Carla paused and looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of apprehension and determination. "Almost. I've scheduled the press release for noon. It's going to hit right when everyone's at lunch, so it'll get the attention we need. The shareholders' letter is ready to go out by email shortly after. Social media's set up to post simultaneously." Ethan smiled. "Good. This is our moment." But even as he said the words, he could feel the gravity of what was about to happen. This wasn't just a business move, it was personal. The board would take this as a direct challenge, one that would make it harder for them to ever accept him. But he had no intention of playing by their rules anymore. If they wanted a war, then so be it. At noon, the press release went live. Ethan stood at the front of his office, looking out across the city. The skyline was as familiar to him as his own skin, but today it felt different. It felt like the beginning of something monumental. He pulled out his phone and opened the news app. The headline on the top of the screen stopped him in his tracks. CEO Ethan Wright announces full ownership of business empire amid tension with board. The article was succinct but impactful, outlining his acquisition of the company and his vision for its future. It included a bold statement from Ethan, calling out the outdated practices of the previous leadership and emphasizing his commitment to innovation, diversity, and growth. There were no euphemisms, no hedging. He was clear. This was his company now, and he was going to change it. The timing couldn't have been better. The post went viral within minutes. Shares of the company spiked as media outlets began to pick up the story. Investors who had previously been on the fence now saw an opportunity to ride the wave of change. But for all the public support, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The board would retaliate, and Pierce would be the first to make his move. As if on cue, his phone rang again. "Ethan, I think you need to see this," Carla said. her voice strained. He glanced down at his phone. The news was spreading like wildfire, articles, blogs, Twitter threads, all discussing the same thing. But there was one post that stood out, one that had already gained significant traction. Is this a PR stunt or a hostile takeover? The truth behind Ethan Wright's sudden power play. It was from an investigative journalist named Laura Henson, known for digging into corporate power struggles. The piece was filled with sharp, critical questions, questioning Ethan's qualifications, his sudden rise, and the legality of the transition. But more concerning was the insinuation that Ethan's unconventional acquisition could be challenged in court, even suggesting that there was potential fraud in the way the deal had been structured. Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a professional setback. It was an attack on his character, his credibility. And Laura Henson wasn't the only one. Several other journalists were picking up the story, echoing similar doubts, casting shadows on his legitimacy as CEO. It was a full-scale media blitz, meant to destabilize him before he could make his next move. Carla walked into his office, holding up her phone. "They're spinning it hard, Ethan. The board must have gotten to the press. Pierce isn't wasting any time." Ethan gripped the back of his chair, his mind racing. He had anticipated some pushback, but this level of media scrutiny was faster and more coordinated than he'd imagined. He couldn't afford to let this grow into something uncontrollable. The public opinion, the investors, the employees, they were all watching now. And if this turned into a scandal, it could ruin everything. "We need to address this," Ethan said, his voice tight but steady. "I won't let them question my legitimacy. This ends today." Carla nodded. "I'll get the team on it. We need to put together a response. Something strong, something unshakable." Ethan paced across the room, considering his options. The media was already questioning his leadership, but if he could control the narrative, he could turn this around. He needed to show everyone, investors, employees, the board, that he wasn't just a man who had lucked into this position. He had earned it, and he would not be bullied into stepping down. "Get me a statement," Ethan said, his voice now filled with purpose. "I want it clear. This company isn't going to be run by people who don't believe in the future. I'm not some fluke. I'm the CEO, and no one's going to take that from me." Carla's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, preparing a new response for the press and social media. The letter would be concise, direct, and unapologetic, one that would turn the tide back in his favor. Meanwhile, Ethan's phone buzzed once more. It was a text from Pierce. "You're making a huge mistake, Ethan. You're in over your head. I'm giving you a chance to step back, for your sake. Don't make me go public with this." Ethan read the message and felt a wave of cold anger rise within him. Pierce was trying to bully him, trying to play the game with his usual tactics, intimidation and threats. But Ethan wasn't the same man who had first walked into this office. He had faced worse than this. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. He typed out a quick response, then hit send. "Bring it, I'm not going anywhere." He leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath as he prepared for the next stage of this battle. The war wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Carla re-entered his office a few moments later, holding up the finalized statement. "Here it is, ready for you to review." Ethan read the statement carefully, nodding with approval. It was everything he wanted. Strong, clear, and uncompromising. "I'll post this in 30 minutes, he said, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Let's show them who they're really dealing with." And as the clock ticked down to the moment of truth, Ethan realized one thing. The battle for this company was far from over. But if he played his cards right, he could win not just the war, but the respect of everyone who had ever doubted him. The press release was a turning point. As soon as it went live, the floodgates opened. The media buzzed with reactions, some supportive, others questioning. Investors reached out, asking for clarity on the future of the company. But as expected, the board was furious, and Pierce, predictably, wasted no time in escalating his campaign against Ethan. By the time Ethan arrived at the office the following morning, he already knew what was coming. The emails were flooding in, many of them from legal teams and high-profile media outlets. A few were even from sympathetic shareholders, unsure of how to navigate the murky waters now swirling around the company. Carla met him outside the elevator with a look of concern etched across her face. "The board's called an emergency meeting for this afternoon," she said. "They're not happy, Ethan. Pierce is pushing them to go public with everything." Ethan's expression darkened, but he remained composed. Let them expose themselves for what they are." He walked toward his office, Carla following closely behind. Inside, the atmosphere felt different today, charged, like the air before a storm. The usual hum of productivity was replaced by a quiet undercurrent of tension. Ethan's presence had stirred the pot, and it was clear that people were nervous about the fallout. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, scanning the latest developments. The media was relentless. Stories had already been written about his leadership, speculating on everything from the legality of the company's acquisition to his qualifications as CEO. But there were also a few voices pushing back against the negativity. Commentators who saw Ethan's rise as an act of defiance, as the necessary change the company needed. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from an anonymous source inside the company. "Pierce is already trying to rally support behind the scenes. He's meeting with key players this afternoon. They want to move quickly." Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. This wasn't just about boardroom politics anymore. This was personal. Pierce was using his connections to try and undermine Ethan's authority, turning his allies against him. "Carla," Ethan said, his voice sharp, "get a list of who's on that meeting. I want to know exactly who's involved. We need to act fast." "Already on it," she replied, already pulling up the details on her phone. "It's mostly the old guard, Carlton, Jennings, and a few others from finance and operations." Ethan exhaled slowly. These were the people who would fight the hardest to keep control. But they were also the ones who had been complicit in the company's stagnation, its unwillingness to adapt, to innovate. They had grown comfortable in their positions of power, and the thought of losing it to someone like him was unacceptable to them. "I need to make sure they understand that this isn't about me," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's about the future of this company. I'm going to fight for this place, for the employees, for the vision I believe in. If they're not with me, they're against me." Carla nodded. "You'll need to do more than just make an announcement. Pierce and the others are already painting you as an outsider, a threat to their established way of doing things." Ethan stood up and walked over to the window. The city stretched out beneath him, the sun casting long shadows over the buildings. This wasn't just a battle for power. It was a battle for control over the direction of an entire company. A company that he believed could become a leader in its field, if only given the chance. "I'm not backing down," he said finally. "This is mine, Carla, and I'm going to fight for it with everything I have." As the day wore on, the tension grew. The scheduled board meeting loomed over him like a shadow, the air thick with anticipation. But Ethan was ready. He had made his decision. There was no turning back now. The boardroom was a sterile, cold space, designed for formality, for power plays, and for high-stakes decisions. Today, it felt more like a battlefield. Ethan walked in first, flanked by Carla, his trusted ally, and David, a former mentor who had recently thrown his weight behind Ethan's bid to take control of the company. David's loyalty had been hard-won, but it was solid now, and Ethan knew he could count on him. Pierce and the others were already seated at the long mahogany table, the room abuzz with whispered conversations. The tension was palpable. "Ethan," Pierce greeted him coolly, his smile tight. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan nodded, offering a polite but distant smile in return. "I'm sure you have." He took his seat at the head of the table, the seat that had once belonged to someone else. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, none of them willing to make eye contact with him directly. Ethan could sense the unease, but it only made him more resolute. He had done everything to ensure this moment would come, and now that it had, he wasn't about to cower. Pierce leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ethan's with a predatory gleam. "We have a lot to discuss," your sudden rise to power, the legality of your actions, and of course the future of the company. I'm sure you understand that your position is questionable." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right. My position is questionable. That's what happens when you're faced with the kind of stagnation this company's been through for years. If you think for a second that I'm going to let you and the others drag this company down with your archaic methods, you're sorely mistaken." A few of the board members shifted in their seats. It was clear that Ethan's bluntness had caught them off guard. Pierce smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort in the room. "We'll see about that. The legal team is already reviewing your actions, and we're prepared to go to court if necessary. We're not going to let this stand." David, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "What are you really afraid of, Pierce? That Ethan will do what you couldn't? Move this company forward. Actually innovate. Attract talent instead of holding on to outdated practices. If you want to waste time with legal threats, be my guest. But don't kid yourself into thinking that'll change the fact that this company needs change. It's already happening." Pierce's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see how much change you can really bring when the board decides it's time for you to leave, Ethan." The words were heavy, the threat clear. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice unwavering. "And neither is this company's future." The room fell into a heavy silence, each board member weighing their options. But Ethan knew something they didn't. He had already made his next move, and no matter what they decided, they couldn't stop it now. The tension that hung in the air after the board meeting felt like a ticking time bomb. Ethan knew that this confrontation was far from over, and that the battle would be fought in more than just the boardroom. Pierce wasn't someone who would simply roll over. This was personal for him, and Ethan could sense that things were about to escalate. As Ethan returned to his office, his mind raced. He had made his case in front of the board, but he wasn't naive enough to think that one meeting would be enough to secure his place. Pierce and the old guard wouldn't just let him walk away with the victory. They'd find another way to strike back. Carla was already waiting for him when he stepped into the room. She was poring over her phone, her brow furrowed as she read the latest developments. "Talk to me," Ethan said, crossing to his desk and sitting down. "Pierce is already working on a smear campaign," Carla replied, her tone grim. "I've seen a few drafts of emails he's sending to the board. He's questioning your leadership in every possible way. Your qualifications, your ability to lead, even your integrity." Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "Let him. It's not the first time I've been questioned." Carla shook her head. "It's not just about you anymore, Ethan. He's targeting everyone who's aligned with you. The old guard's trying to turn the tide. They're threatening to pull their support and make this public." "Then we go public first," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "We get ahead of them. We tell our story before they can spin theirs." Carla raised an eyebrow. "You think that'll work?" Ethan met her gaze. "It's our only choice." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Ethan had expected a battle, but the level of hostility coming from Pierce and the board caught him off guard. What had started as a power struggle had quickly escalated into an all-out corporate war. The smear campaign was gaining traction, with articles and social media posts questioning Ethan's leadership, his qualifications, and his motivations. It was clear that Pierce was not going to let this go without a fight. But Ethan wasn't backing down. He had come too far, and the stakes were too high. The public's opinion had already begun to shift in his favor, but the real battle was taking place behind closed doors, inside the boardrooms, in the conference calls, and in the private meetings with investors who were watching everything unfold. Ethan and Carla worked tirelessly, countering every negative article, posting carefully crafted responses on social media, and arranging interviews with key journalists who were more sympathetic to his cause. They made sure to highlight the company's future plans, focusing on innovation and growth, things the board had neglected for years. As the tension grew, Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the board would make their move. But he had a plan of his own, one that would force them to either accept him or face public humiliation. By the end of the week, The moment he'd been preparing for arrived. Ethan scheduled a press conference, one that would be broadcast live to shareholders, media outlets, and the entire company. This was going to be his declaration, his statement to the world that he was the rightful leader of the company, and that anyone who wanted to challenge him would have to go through him. Carla was pacing nervously in the conference room, watching the final details fall into place. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of doubt. "This could change everything." Ethan looked at her, his gaze calm but determined. "This will change everything. It's time the world saw what Pierce and the board are really up to. They think they can take me down, but I'm not backing down. If they want to fight, then let's fight." The press conference was scheduled to start in an hour. Ethan walked to the front of the room, where a podium and a row of cameras were set up. He looked out over the crowd of reporters and analysts, some of whom had been critical of him, others who were just looking for a sensational headline. But now, he was the one in control. He cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today," Ethan began, his voice steady and confident. "I'm here to address the recent attacks on my leadership and the future of this company. For those who are unfamiliar with my story, I'm Ethan Wright, and I've worked for this company for over a decade, earning my place every step of the way. I didn't inherit this position. I didn't buy my way in. I earned it." The room was silent, all eyes on him. "I know that some of you may be questioning my ability to lead," he continued, "but let me be clear. The company's survival depends on change. It depends on vision, and that's exactly what I bring to the table. The old guard, people like Pierce Matthews and Richard Carlton, have been running this company for years, but they've kept it stagnant. They've put their own interests ahead of the future of this business." Ethan paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They've attacked me, they've smeared my name, and they've tried to undermine everything I've done. But I'm not just fighting for my position. I'm fighting for this company. I'm fighting for every single person in this room, for the employees, the investors, the people who believe in the future of this business." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I am the CEO, and I will lead this company into a new era. If the board doesn't want to be part of that, then they can leave. But make no mistake, I will not be pushed out." A murmur spread across the room. Ethan could feel the shift, the change in the atmosphere. The reporters who had been skeptical just moments ago were now intrigued, leaning in, listening intently. "This company belongs to those who are willing to fight for it," he said. "I've made my decision. The board can either support this vision or step aside. The choice is theirs." As the press conference wrapped up, Ethan stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment he made his stand, publicly and irrevocably. He had put everything on the line, and now the world would see who was really in charge. In the days that followed, the board's response was swift and brutal. Pierce and his allies publicly denounced Ethan's statements, accusing him of overstepping his bounds and jeopardizing the company's stability. Legal threats escalated, and rumors of a potential shareholder revolt began to swirl. But the public perception of Ethan began to shift in a way he hadn't anticipated. The media, while still critical of his tactics, began to acknowledge the need for change at the top. Investor confidence, which had initially wavered, began to rise again, fueled by the renewed focus on innovation and growth. Ethan's call for a modern progressive leadership style resonated with younger shareholders and employees, many of whom had grown disillusioned with the old guard. In private, the board continued to meet behind closed doors, but cracks were beginning to show. Some members of the board, unsure of Pierce's aggressive tactics, started to question whether he was the right person to lead the company. A few key executives who had once sided with Pierce began to quietly distance themselves, seeing Ethan as the better choice for the company's future. Ethan knew this wasn't over. He had made his move, but the battle was far from won. But now, for the first time, He felt the power of momentum shifting in his favor. The breakthrough came when one of the company's largest investors, a venture capital firm that held a significant stake in the company, publicly backed Ethan. The firm released a statement in support of his vision for the future, calling for a vote of confidence in his leadership. This was the turning point. As the board's resistance crumbled, the pressure mounted on Pierce and the others. They had underestimated Ethan's resolve, and now they were facing a very real possibility of losing control of the company they had once run with impunity. And then, the moment came, the vote of confidence. The day of the vote arrived and the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan stood at the head of the conference table, surrounded by Carla, David, and his small team of trusted allies. They had spent hours strategizing, preparing for every possible outcome. But deep down, Ethan knew the odds were in his favor. The tide had shifted. The votes were being counted, and the board was on the edge of collapse. Pierce sat across from him, his face a mask of calculation. His usual smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of quiet desperation. He knew that this was it. Either he would hold on to his position, or he would be swept aside. The final count came in, and the room went still. Ethan's heart raced as the numbers were read aloud. One by one, the votes in favor of Ethan's leadership stacked up, while Pierce's supporters faltered. Finally, the chairman of the board stood up, his voice solemn. "The vote is clear. Ethan Wright has the confidence of the board. The motion to remove him as CEO has failed." A ripple of relief spread through Ethan's team. Carla smiled, David gave a nod of approval, and even the few board members who had hesitated earlier now gave him a quiet acknowledgement. Pierce, however, sat in stunned silence, his face pale as the reality of the defeat set in. Ethan stood up slowly, his gaze meeting Pierce's for the first time since the vote. He didn't say a word. The silence between them spoke volumes. "We're done here," Ethan said calmly. "You can pack your things, Pierce. You've lost." The room erupted into a murmur, but Ethan remained composed, his confidence unshaken. The battle was over, but the war for the future of the company had just begun. As Ethan walked out of the room, he knew that this victory was just the beginning. The company was now in his hands, and he was ready to lead it into a new era, one where change, innovation, and leadership meant something real. The old guard had been toppled, and Ethan Wright was now firmly in control, and this time he wasn't going anywhere.